I titled my notes, my draft of this talk, Burning Bush. That just is the image that came to me. But you know, in the Orthodox icons of Moses before the burning bush, they interpret the burning bush to be all of creation. And so that all of creation is a fire, you know, with the light of God, the eminence of the Holy Spirit. So it turned out to be a quite fitting image for this whole talk. Where is wisdom emerging in the 21st century? Where is it? I can't read my writing. Where is it nudging us to grow, to wake up, to act? Gilbert of Hoyland, a 12th century Cistercian, said, quoting the book of Proverbs, "Wisdom cries in the streets." And he said, because wisdom cries in the streets, that's why we have to make the circuit of creation. So he was pointing to the fact that wisdom, the Holy Spirit, is out there in unexpected places in creation and so forth, and we have to make the circuit of creation. Recently I read a description of a conference of Buddhist teachers, and the topic that they dealt with is the question of, in what way is the world hurting in our day? And then the answer, then one of the attendant questions is, and how does our practice deal with that? And I think I'd like to underscore that that's, to me, the fundamental question. You know, how does this translate to the practical world that we're dealing with and struggling with in our day and age? We recently, in my community in New York, watched a documentary called The Italian Secret, which was about how many Italians risked their lives to save Jewish people during World War II. And it showed actually a union of 23 monasteries that also took in Jewish people and tried to give them passports and so forth to save them. And the question that arose in my mind is, you know, was it the seeding of the gospel over generations that gave these people the instinct to save Jewish people? I think it's a very clear example of that. So the fire of the gospel is the ultimate measuring stick for looking at wisdom and the way we look at the wisdom that's emerging in our day. There's a wonderful line from a Robert Bly poem that I love to quote, and it's meant in a totally different context, but I think it's interesting. And he says, the fire that tests gold is there. And that's the way the gospel is. The gospel tests the fire. It is the acid that tests gold. Recently, this past September, I was visiting Kylemore Abbey in Ireland, and I met a German Benedictine abbess from Dinklage and a German Benedictine monk from Munster, Schwarzach. And both of those monasteries were remodeling buildings and places on their grounds for refugees. And it was just very evident to me that we Americans live in a kind of splendid isolation. Since the 60s, my personal presiding spirits or household gods, my heroes, have been Thomas Merton, Teilhard de Chardin, and Carl Gustav Jung, but also Dorothy Day. And in 1969 to 1970, I had the privilege of living at the Catholic Worker, knowing Dorothy very well and serving the poor, rejected, and marginalized that Christ loves so much. Let me say also, in the context of my general topic, that Dorothy was a great Christian humanist. I loved talking to her about the great Russian novelists, about Sigrid Undset, Solzhenitsyn, and so on. Her soul was wide, deep, and utterly generous. So making the circuit of creation, that's the Che Quircoins Circuisti line from the Antiphon of Hildegard. Going out from the center and integrating and incorporating and including. A year after Thomas Merton's death, Sister Mary Therese Lentfort, a good friend of his, had a poem published in America magazine in honor of Thomas Merton, and one line goes, "His hermitage had 1,000 windows." And sometimes I feel that my hermitage has 10,000 windows. I'll say hermitage with quotes. We tend to be overshadowed with information in our day and age, and therefore it's necessary to have a filter and to integrate around a particular center in order to have a focus and to make things relate to that center. In the book Blessed Simplicity, which was a discussion of contemporary monasticism by Raimundo Panikkar says that classic monasticism, the challenge was renunciation, but the real challenge for us nowadays is integration. Now I think renunciation is involved in how we integrate, okay? But I think it's a very valid point. I'd like to say something about what I envisioned this talk to be. I thought I would talk about certain wisdom sutras that are arising in our day, that are in a kind of confluence, that are creating the new wisdom that later I'll be talking about Father Bruno's approach to the new wisdom. And so, for example, interreligious dialogue is a major wisdom sutra emerging in our day and age. And I and Father Cyprian have been involved in it, and also Father James Wiseman. Ecology and responsible relationship to the earth, sustainability and so forth is another major wisdom sutra. And the Holy Father's new encyclical Laudato Si is a signal contribution in this area. When Teilhard de Chardin wrote the Phenomenon of Man, the title in German is Das Pfeil der Humanitas, which means the arrow of mankind, that evolution is like an arrow. But I've done enough Teilhardian studies to know that that arrow is not inevitable and it's not automatic. In fact, a great scholar of Teilhard at Fordham University says the whole thing could abort. But it could abort if we don't, as human beings, get involved, and as Teilhard uses the image of grabbing the rudder and helping to steer the ship. And I think that the challenges coming up in biomedicine and so forth are an example of where we, with ethical discernment and great wisdom, have to help steer the ship and guide the future, peace studies and so forth. So a major question is, where do we stand in history? A friend of mine asked me, what are you talking about to the abbots? And I said, well, I guess you would say it's where we stand in history. And then I laughed and said, maybe I should have chosen a bigger topic. It's because we live in a time of pessimism and gloom and even apocalypticism that I think we need a vision of hope. A good friend of mine, an Anglican deacon in California who's in charge of the whole diaconate formation program in San Francisco, said that his one addiction is hope. So first of all, I'd like to present a few ideas from Father Bruno, who's written 2 books on wisdom. He said one time that it's been the major concern for 30 years of his life to articulate what a new wisdom would look like for our day and age. He strongly believes that early Christianity was sapiential, and he furthermore believes that monks, particularly in monastic life, contributed in a very special way to the sapiential character of early Christianity because of our emphasis on interiority and inwardness and so forth. I'd like to share a story with you about a Baptist, or at least evangelical theologian down in Texas, I think it was, who was giving a course on Christian humanism, so he decided to invite a secular humanist to give one presentation. And when the secular humanist asked him, what's the topic of my talk? And he said, I'd like you to relate to Christian humanism. The secular humanist said, there's no such animal. That there was an incompatibility between Christianity and humanism. And I have to say that the most widespread critique that I've run into of Christianity is that it's world-denying and that it teaches people to escape out of this world and so forth, which is certainly not true. In my last talk with Father Bruno last June, he said that his central concern was to identify the way in which the energy of Christ had created Western history. Now, despite secularization and so forth, so that some of the major values of the gospel have entered in a secular way, for example, into the American political system, the Bill of Rights and so forth, honoring of the person. Both Father Bruno and I were indebted to a book, Saving the Appearances, written by Owen Barfield, one of the four Inklings, along with C.S. Lewis and Charles Williams and Tolkien. And I just finished reading a huge volume on the Inklings called, I forget the name of it, but it's a wonderful study by Philip and Carol Zaleski. They're Oblates of St. Benedict at Petersham. And it's a magnificent study of the Inklings and how important they've been in shaping literature of the 20th century towards the imaginal and so forth. And anyhow, that book, Saving the Appearances, is about the evolution of consciousness. And Barfield felt that the early age of man, the primitive age, was an immersion in nature and so forth, which he called a original participation. And then with the development of reason and critical thinking and so forth, we moved away from that original participation. But because of that, experience a kind of estrangement, and so that what we have to do is create a secondary participation through a new kind of thinking, a wisdom thinking. Both Bruno and I felt that that was a major influence on our lives. I read it when I was 19 years old. I was just out of high school, I think. And I picked it up at a department store. It was on sale, and it was a profound influence on me. So there's this need for second wisdom. And I'd like to read Father Bruno's description of second wisdom. He says, the second wisdom is a knowledge of metaphor, a river of likeness that winds through all creation, nourishing the extremes of diversity, gathering the farthest flung in all its penetrating simplicity and purity. It is a bazaar and open gate, and a market where you can come from all directions to tell you the one thing that you do not know. You recognize them by the one thing shining in their eyes, though their robes and turbans are of many strange styles and wild colors, though their gestures are barbaric and unrefined, the movements of peasants and kings. They all bring the same essence in its thousand forms, and in its very preciousness, the entrancing, living light of this God. In its quickness, in its mercurial manyness, its inexpressible consistency in all ways. And then you say, what did he say? It's all poetry, It just unfolds and unfolds and unfolds, And his homilies were like that. Everybody commented on his homilies. It was just one association after another, one scripture passage related to another. And he had it all interiorly. And one image leading to another image. And so not a rational expose of a theme so much as a poetic consideration, very much like patristic exegesis. So it reminds me of John 3, the Spirit blows where it wills. And then you say to yourself, what did he say? And you've caught a glimpse of a deep intuition, but to put it into words is quite a challenge. Listening to Father Bruno gives you that feeling, that intuition. It's a poetic and deeply penetrating insight. It's an expression of a sensibility rather than an analysis expressed in concepts. So Bruno argued that there was an initial classic wisdom in early Christianity, the first wisdom he calls it. However, it was eventually eclipsed by the movement of history and thought. Bruno also felt that monasticism, which played such an important role in the early centuries of Christianity, can and should play a significant role in the emergence of a new sapiential Christianity. In the third talk, I'll sort of lay out the how we do that. He felt there is already a sapiential turn in our culture as a whole, manifested in various ways, for example, in the turn to the East, the emergence of feminism, the rapprochement of science and spirituality, transpersonal psychology, and so on. I see it also in the increasing influence of Western Christianity coming from the Eastern Christian tradition. I might note at this point the tremendous resource in a website called Monks and Mermaids, which many of you already know about. Compiled by a monk of Belmont Abbey in England, David Bird, it is an amazing list of articles regarding monastic and Eastern Christian spirituality. Also, several years ago, the National Liturgy Conference at Mundelein had at its theme divinization, and I was amazed. Evidently, the phrase deification or theosis is now becoming more at home in the West. In fact, I think that the meeting and interchange of Eastern and Western Christianity is one of the major sutras contributing to the emergence of a new sapiential Christianity in our time. Wisdom, let us attend. You know, that's what the deacon says when he comes out to announce the gospel. He comes out of the doors and he's holding up the gospel book and says, wisdom, let us attend. Okay. Interestingly, Father Bruno never really had much interest in Eastern Christianity. Sure, he certainly knew the Eastern Fathers, the Greek Fathers, but what's happened in Eastern Christianity, you know, in the last century or so, he just wasn't very interested. I think there was sort of a blind spot or just lack of interest. Now, the next thing I'd like to move on to is another wisdom sutra that I think is very important, and it's to be aware of the connection between globalism and localism. You know that many activists use the motto, think globally but act locally. So working with local communities and regions is a must for monasteries in our day. Again, to some extent, this may have already been true in many cases, many monasteries. For example, recently following a website of a group called Front Porch Republic, it was mentioned that the abbot of Our Lady of Genesee attended a small group meeting of Front Porch Republic in the upstate New York, Rochester area. I thought to myself, right move. Front Porch Republic is a virtual community of writers and commentators, self-styled down-home philosophers who are concerned with living on a human scale, distribution of power, sustainability, to mention a few of their themes, and who also ask what kind of matrix is necessary for human flourishing. That's an important question for wisdom in our day. What kind of matrix is necessary for human flourishing? And so when we in monasteries are furthering local and regional ecological causes or discussing initiatives for care of the homeless, whatever, our support is a significant witness. In our area of New York State, over the past 5 years or more, fracking for natural gas was a significant issue. And I'm going to tell them about our lawyers saying that we didn't realize it, but our witness of refusing to sign a lease just for money and taking a stand for the care of the earth was a significant witness to local people because, as he said, they all know you need money. So, okay. Just a week or so ago, I came across a very interesting website called Solidarity Hall. The participants tend to be young, earnest Catholics, for the most part, if you are not, who are committed to neighborhoods, to personalism, to humane and just ways of living. They list among their guiding spirits people like Dorothy Day, Wendell Berry, Jane Jacobs, E.F. Schumacher, and so on. And I'd like to read their mission statement. Notice the values they mention: personalism, right livelihood, and local solutions. Quote, think of Solidarity Hall as a hospitable old hostelry, a mental oasis in the deserted landscapes that surround us. We no longer have the coffee houses of 18th century London, where Samuel Johnson and his friends said more of substance in an hour than our blogs today could manage in a week. Nor do we have a local culture of pubs such as Chesterton's Old Cheshire Cheese, where friendship could flourish easily, even amidst clashing opinions. And please don't bring up Starbucks, where laptop solipsism mostly rules. So where can we champions of the commons convene, at least in a virtual sense, snugly out of the big media weather? We're tempted to feel that a kind of mental poverty and lack of moral vision afflict almost every neighborhood. It's a pretty strong statement. We are tempted to feel that a kind of mental poverty and lack of moral vision afflict almost every neighborhood. While public discourse is in many places becoming less civil and sane, we hope to be a beacon of civility. Where the cult of technocracy reigns, we hope to be the advocates of a humble personalism. Where small-scale solutions to neighborhood problems are ignored, we hope to be their champions. See, I think, for example, the uniting of the community around the for the Human Development Office. It's ecumenical, and it has really brought them together peacefully and for a good cause. It's a good example. Thus we see our project to begin with as that of several of the big words we use: community, work, neighbor, history, imagination. Like the Polish trade union remembered in our name, we are pushing back against another wall, that of ideological blindness, built jointly by camps representing the state on one hand and the market on the other. Like the solidarity movement, we desire nothing less than to change public perception of our social condition, and then in our lives and our communities to act. If your aim is to become a real citizen and a true neighbor, walk through our open door and join us. I think that's a very energetic and committed and imaginative statement. I find it really puts its finger on some really important issues for our day and age. And it's the kind of thing that monasteries ought to be linked with. These people are articulate, brilliant, yet down to earth. Again, I see this happening. For example, New Kamalvale has a linkage with the Zen community of Tassajara and a Native American community in its region. Francis Klein, the Trappist, abbot of Mepkin, worked strongly with a local ecological group for preservation of the nearby river, which touches their property. And I think that's still being carried on by the present community after Francis's death. Where we are in upstate New York, the west side of the Catskills, we have contacts with two Zen communities, Daibozatsu and Mount Tremper. The main building at Mount Tremper was a former Catholic novitiate, by the way, and Peter Morin worked on the construction of it. Isn't that interesting? We have contact with several Buddhist communities of other varieties, such as Tibetan and Chinese. And the interior of our new library building was done by two Zen monks of Mount Tremper who lived in our guest house for the duration of their work project. They loved working and living in our environment. Next, I would like to move on to another wisdom sutra. I don't know quite what to call it. It's really a cluster of thinkers. Call them philosophers in general, although some of them teach literature. And you were probably saying, here we go into the stratosphere if I talk about philosophy, but I really think, honestly, that they're very, very important. They are full of insight for understanding for what a sacred humanitas for the 21st century might look like. In one way, they cluster around a thinker, philosopher, historian who had roots in Louisiana. His name is Eric Voegelin, and being Jewish, he escaped Nazi Germany. And because of that trauma and losing many friends in the Shoah, he decided to spend the rest of his career asking the question, what creates order in history? He eventually wrote a 4-volume world history with the overall title, Order in History. In Volume 1, Israel and Revelation, Voegelin comes to a summary point, quote, "The order of society and history is constituted, in fact, by those persons who confront the disorder of surrounding society with the order they find within themselves." Again, the inner person as resource. Voegelin was urgently seeking a wisdom for our times. One of the major thinkers in this cluster is William Desmond, currently perhaps Ireland's most well-known philosopher, but I think not very well known in the United States. He teaches at Louvain in Belgium, by the way. His central concern is to develop a philosophy of living in what's called the metaxy. That's a term that was central to Voegelin's work. Metaxy comes from the Symposium of Plato, and it means what's between heaven above and earth below. It's that total human realm. So how do we live in this wide expanse of human experience? It's the realm that the angels, wisdom angels' middle wings encircle circling. His notion of metaxy is open to transcendence above as well as transcendence within immanence. And by the way, when I talk about metaxy to groups or classes and so forth, I say, you may think it's a Greek restaurant or a rock band because you will find both on the internet, but it's really a term from philosophy. Desmond was briefly in the Dominicans in Ireland as a young man, and when he speaks of the religious culture in which he grew up, he is very articulate about its effect on him. It provided, he said, a house of meaning. He says, there were sacramental rituals, keeping open, a space of porosity, which is a word he loves to use. It means openness, porosity, between the human soul and what ultimately exceeds it, even if in intimate communication with it. This offered a way of dwelling in the world with a non-literalistic mindfulness, a poetry of the divine. And that's all over, to me, some of his most engaging writing. What is the poetry of the divine? This is mystery as cultural matrix, rather than the flat land of positivistic scientism. And that is why George Steiner, the culture critic, says that we are living in an unhoused world. We don't have a large house of meaning that we all share. It is not surprising that Desmond, a very well-established and respected philosopher, could write about the poverty of contemporary philosophy. I think that's very significant. He is not an outsider taking cynical potshots at philosophy, but a very respected philosopher who is an expert on Hegel and much of continental philosophy. Desmond's key book is called Being and the Between. It is enormously challenging to read. It was Edward Emery who advised me to read it. I still haven't plowed through more than 2 chapters, but it's very important. There's a need for people who are step-down transformers who can take his insights and put them into more accessible form. But if you find interviews with Desmond on the internet, you will find a freshness, a down-to-earth immediacy, and a clear perception. He is a deeply spiritual person. I don't know whether he's practicing his faith, but he's deeply spiritual himself. And one finds a kind of whimsical side, as with Father Bruno. Father Bruno had a great whimsical side, great sense of humor, and a side that is strongly interested in the poetic. In one interview, for example, he commented on the theological movement called Radical Orthodoxy, and he said, these are theologians who are on fire. These are a group of English theologians who are very abstract, very great scholars of theology, but they have a strong belief that comes through. It's just perceptible. And so they'll use the Eucharist, as an example of what they're talking about. They just don't apologize for their faith. Desmond says that his whole career is devoted to explaining what it means to live in metaxy, in the in-betweenness. I think that the full range of in-betweenness is exactly what our fullness, the fullness of our stature in Christ is meant to lead to. Our full personhood, only realized in Christ perfectly, and by us in approximation by participation. And so, for example, when Isaac the Syrian talks about we must, come to the point where we have so much compassion that we identify with the suffering of animals and even lower forms of life, such as serpents and so forth. This is the movement into metaxy. This is the fullness of our stature in Christ. This is taking on the mind of Christ. I will comment on this when in my last talk I will mention symbols of the Transfiguration. Pope Francis, in his talk at the Florence Cathedral on the new humanism, urged that it be practical, that it flow from our identification with and incorporation into the mind of Christ, which also means being led by the Spirit. If man is the measure of all things, surely for us as believers, Christ is the measure of man. These are but a few insights of the type that we need for a new humanism. Pope Francis calls for a new humanism, as did Benedict XVI and Pope St. John Paul II. All of them saw a new humanism as the Church's response to the present crisis of civilization.